Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on the COP21 agenda and the successful Paris Agreement. My name is Nicole. I'm the marketing manager at South Pole Group, on whose behalf I'm happy to welcome you here today. Before we move into the official part, I would like to briefly give you an overview of what South Pole Group does. Majority of you know us, but those who don't, we are the expert in sustainability related topics. Our expertise ranges from climate change, forest and land use, water, sustainable cities and buildings, and renewable energy and efficiency solutions. Now, we are proud to be represented across the globe, both with our office presence, our experts on the ground, and also with the variety of solutions we provide to our private companies, our public partners, and also to NGO customers. Now, today the agenda is packed. I'm happy to have three of my colleagues here, namely our CEO Renate Heuberger, Christian Danneke, our Director of Sustainable Supply Chains and Land Use, and Martin Stadelmann, our Practice Leader on Cities and Climate Finance. We will hear today three presentations, each of 10 minutes, after which we'll have 10 to 15 minutes Q&A session. Now, to the technical aspects of the webinar, we have received a great amount of questions already, and also we have more than 200 participants today. So we'll keep you all on mute during the webinar, and we will answer the questions we have already received. As you can see, we are sharing our screen with you, but you can also use the functionality of handout where today's presentation is uploaded. Out of your further interest, the recording of the webinar will be available as of tomorrow, together with the presentation itself. Now, I will not delay this any further and hand over to Renate to kick off the webinar.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Renate Heuberger, CEO of the South Pole Group, and I would like to introduce this webinar by asking the question very simply: what is it actually, this Paris Agreement? Many of you, I'm sure all of you actually have heard or have read somehow that this agreement was historic. And others of you may have heard that, well, actually there wasn't much in this agreement. So I hope that at the end of this short intervention, you will have a feeling what actually is in, why is it actually historic after all. So the Paris Agreement is the successor of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol itself has been adopted nearly 20 years ago in Kyoto, as the name says, and has been the first contract, the first legally binding contract that was agreed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Those days, 19 years ago, the whole situation was much easier. There were much less people negotiating, and the text was much easier. So over the past 19 years, it has become much more complicated to agree on text, and that's already the first conclusion. It is quite amazing that delegates from 195 countries, 30,000 participants in the conference, were actually able to agree on a document, and it is important to note it was a unanimous decision. Unanimous means that all countries, Ukraine, Russia, Gabon, US, China, everybody has agreed. And this is remarkable in this world of tensions and wars and problems. The agreement, and that is different from all previous agreements down to the Kyoto Protocol itself. This agreement is legally binding. It means that it has to be ratified by parliaments to enter into force. It enters into force if at least 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions are ultimately in agreement. So now, if and when these countries ratify the Paris Agreement, what will be in? The agreement consists of various parts. various elements that are binding. The legally binding elements are essentially the following. The agreement binds countries to come up with pledges, so-called nationally determined contributions. What that means is that every country which is a part of the agreement has to come up with a proposal, with a pledge on what exactly it is going to do, what kind of policies it's going to agree on. The agreement also binds countries to do this in a more or less agreed format, in a public registry. It also asks participants to use the highest possible ambition, but that's it, it's the highest possible ambition, it doesn't specify much more. And it also asks participants to review these pledges every 5 years to increase the ambition. And last but not least, the agreement also creates a transparency framework, which means that countries, participants in the parts of the agreement will track their emissions and will track the progress they have achieved. Frankly, that's actually it. That's the legally binding part of the agreement. In addition to that legally binding part, the agreement also prepares the flower bed of a lot of concepts, such as, and we'll hear more about from my colleagues, sustainable development mechanisms, voluntary cooperation between governments, result-based finance for forests, capacity development, technology transfer. It also talks about finance and about adaptation. But all these elements are actually concepts, and there's no further legally binding text in the agreement. So, what does the agreement not say? The agreement does not contain any emission reduction targets like the Kyoto Protocol did. The agreement does also not talk about a concrete level of ambition of the individual governments. The agreement also does not ask any participants to do any specific policy. You're free to choose. And also very important, it actually does not request any concrete financial contributions. That's all voluntary. And also, it doesn't contain any sanction mechanism. The Kyoto Protocol did contain sanction mechanisms. It ultimately turned out that these were pretty toothless. So this agreement doesn't even have this mechanism in place. So summing up, Paris, I would say, is a great system shown by a playground, an empty playground. It's a fantastic system with the swing and everything and the slides, but it also only comes into work if and when individual parties are actually starting to have meaningful pledges. So the legally binding nature is a system here. Now you ask, why is this, what makes Paris so special anyway? And I've picked a few elements, and many of you will have different views, but I think a few of these elements are really historic and also show you why ultimately that is an important agreement. First of all, the goal, the purpose of the whole agreement. The purpose is that the world's global temperature rise shall stay well below 2 degrees. And what is very surprising, least developed countries and small island states were able to put in a sentence which says the effort shall be to limit the temperature increase to even as close as 1.5 degrees as possible. So 1.5, that's pretty revolutionary, because to reach that, we need a significant amount of effort. So the purpose in itself is pretty historic. Plus, I would say there have been a few elements. Sometimes you think that's a small element, but I find it nonetheless very, very interesting. The first one I list here, this agreement is completely bottom-up instead of top-down. It proved over the past 19 years of painful negotiations that any effort to try a top-down approach, where it would be a global target, was essentially not working. The countries' preferences were too different. The second element, and I find this is very, very smart. In the Kyoto Protocol, you had an Annex 2, which distinguished the world into two sections, namely the developed countries and the developing countries. That was based in 1997. Countries like China India, Saudi Arabia, Korea are these days much richer than many so-called developed countries. So the global balance of power has shifted. And it is, of course, very difficult to continue with the same list in an annex. It was the solution they found, which was very smart, is they still make a distinction between developed and developing country, but every country ultimately has to choose whether it wants to consider itself a developing country. So there's certain pressure. A country like Korea, which is obviously not a developing country, Singapore, not the obvious developing countries, they probably will choose to be a developed country simply because they don't want to be associated with developing world in this strict sense. Another very important element was that over both weeks in Paris, people were very aware that if this agreement has to pass, has to get ratified by the United States, it would not pass the US Senate. So the text was very carefully done in a way that there is no Senate approval needed. This in turn means that there is no financial commitment and no emission reduction target, but the agreement can enter into force without the US Congress and Senate to approve. Very smartly done. This means that Obama himself can actually decide to ratify by himself. The transparency framework I mentioned is also quite smart. There was a long debate as to how stringent the reporting should be, and countries like China, for instance, were very reluctant to have international auditing of their books. The solution here is that the framework is simply public and transparent, meaning that NGOs and the civil society can ultimately step in and monitor. So another smart solution to a problem. Now, one which will keep us busy for the next minutes with Christian, which is also extremely smart, is markets. If you search the whole agreement for the word market, you find it 5 times, but always in the combination of non-markets. So the agreement talks about non-markets. It never ever talks about markets, but it does that in such a smart way that everybody understands that actually the agreement endorses carbon markets. It just happens to avoid the word. That was a compromise to get all these countries on board who had strict red line and did not want market in the contract. So it's in, but nobody talks about it. And also, last but not least, for the first time in such a document, this government-to-government approach explicitly encourages private players to act. This involvement of private players is historic as well, because it acknowledges that without the involvement of private players, governments alone won't do it. So that ends my short intervention in the beginning. I hope you do agree with me that this agreement is historic and provides a good path and an inspiring path for actually tackling this problem at its roots. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renat, for your contribution and highlighting the main elements of the Paris Agreement. As you mentioned, the role of private players has been acknowledged, and that nicely links to our next speaker, who will exactly talk about business opportunities after Paris. Now, Christian, the floor is yours. I hope you're unmuted. We managed. Christian, you're unfortunately self-muted. Please, could you unmute yourself? Christian, unfortunately, we cannot hear you. Could you please unmute yourself? If that doesn't work, we will first give a chance to our last speaker and hope that Christian will solve the issues. We will skip through the presentation and we will give the floor to Martin and his contribution on cities and low carbon finance.
Thanks, Nicole. So I'm going to quickly present you whether building on the momentum of Paris, cities can lead the way to a low-carbon future. And I'll also expand a bit on the topic of finance and how cities need finance as other players around the world to implement the Paris Agreement.
Unmuted.
Hello? Want to go back. We are sorry for little technical issues which we're facing with our server. We should be back on track, and we will now start again with Martin. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Nicole. So again, welcome, good evening, or good morning to everybody. My name is Martin Salman. I'm practice leader, cities and climate finance. I'm going to talk on the question whether cities building on a momentum of Paris can lead the way to a low carbon future, and also the kind of finance they need. So the Paris Agreement is actually not just remarkable because of all the things that Renat has just told you. It's also remarkable because it's the first major climate agreement to acknowledge the role of cities in fighting climate change, and also ask them to act more. I mean, this actually makes a lot of sense because cities are clearly one of the most active players in this space. More than 600 cities have pledged to reduce more than gigatons of CO2. So that's more than 3% of global CO2, and that's all voluntary. So there's no binding resolution on them to do that. They're not enough to do that, but they're just voluntary doing that. Some of the cities even go beyond that. Cities like Copenhagen, San Francisco, or Sydney, they even pledge to go carbon neutral, and some of them are really well underway. And we also launched the City Action Platform at COP, and one of the things we looked was to collect information on all city-related events at COP21, and we realized there are more than 250 events there. So clearly, cities lead the way and can play a huge role in implementing the agreement. So now the question is, how do these cities move from pledges to actions? And certainly it's a lot of work they are looking for, and they certainly need support. So South Pole actually tries to help cities to implement their pledges and reduce the carbon footprint. Here's some things that you see, and it also gives a good overview of what cities actually are doing around the world. So for instance, we're involved in helping Mexico City develop a bike sharing system. We develop capacity for cities in India. We look at new carbon markets, local carbon markets in Thailand. We build low carbon towns in Indonesia. We use mobile phone data in the EU to help them, some cities monitor the transport flows. And finally, we also develop new financing solutions, for instance, in Colombia. Now, financing is really at the core of many of our activities we're doing with cities. And now the question for you may have is, why are we focusing so much on cities? And this next slide actually shows the real challenge. Now, cities emit around 70% of global CO2, but if you look at actually finance, international climate flowing to cities, it's only 30%. And now if we go down to the issues of creditworthiness, the situation even becomes worse, because only 20% of cities in developing and emerging economies can access our creditworthy in local markets, and only 5% in international markets. But given the fact that cities have to invest in large-scale infrastructure that is low carbon, so public transport, buildings that don't emit or emit little CO2, they need a lot of capital, and it matters a lot what the capital costs are. So if they're not creditworthy, it means it almost becomes impossible for them to invest in the low carbon infrastructure we need. Now the question is, does the Paris Agreement help on this finance issue, not just for cities, but more in general? I mean, first of all, what is really worthwhile to strengthen is that Paris Agreement actually says that finance is one of the three main measures we need for implementing the agreement, with mitigation and adaptation being the other. So it's really set up at the highest level. But then, as Renat said, it also doesn't really ask countries to come up with concrete numbers in terms of how much they should actually commit. It just sends a really strong general signal for the wider investment community that investment in low carbon assets will pay off. But the agreement itself doesn't really talk about the numbers itself. It just provides a framework, and you can assume following this framework, cities and also many national governments will undertake the right measures right incentives so that the investment community will invest. Now, we're not starting nowhere. If you see at the graph below, the dark blue bar, that's what we need annually per year, roughly 1 trillion in the next 15 years to get on a 2-degree path. That's what the International Energy Agency is estimating. And we're already almost at 400 million, so a bit 1/3 we have. And you can assume that these investments will increase in the next 5 to 10 years following the Paris Agreement. The good thing is actually the investment community is ready. They said, well, we have trillions of dollars under assets and we're willing to invest. We just need the right signals from the governments. On the other hand, we have to say where we didn't really see too much progress in Paris was actually North-South finance. You see in the light blue bar that we're already at roughly $60 billion a year, and in Copenhagen it was agreed that we go up to 100 billion until 2020. But Paris on this specific question on North-South finance was actually more disappointment because, as Renat said, there's no specific number in there. In the non-binding part of the agreement, it actually says, okay, we want to continue another 5 years with at least 100 billion, and then we want to go higher. But it didn't say any specific numbers. So North-South flows, not so much agreement, but in general, we have a good tendency to increase numbers. And now I come to the conclusions or the key takeaways on cities and finance. So first thing to mention is cities are key actors to fight climate change, and this has been acknowledged at COP21. They emit 70% of CO2 and have ambitious pledges. We as South Pole Group help cities to get better access to capital, which is a key issue as only 20% of them are creditworthy. Paris sends a strong signal that investment in low-carbon assets will pay off, and the financial sector has clearly shown its commitment to invest if we see national governments taking actions to implement Paris and go to a 2 degrees future.
Thank you, Martin. Now, hopefully our server is back on track. Christian, can you hear us? Christian?
I don't know what they're doing with the internet. Take this one. Change the internet to this one. Change Wi-Fi.
Oh. Which one? There's no other.
Go to. And then there need to be others. Come on.
No, it should.
Oh, the Android API.
Hello, Christian?
Muted.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for still being there. And sorry for the short break again. I hope everyone hears me now. First of all, thanks, Renat, for you mentioning there's no mention of markets in the agreement. I will mention them now as a main element of my contribution. Good afternoon to Europe and buenos dias para Latinoamérica. I'll focus on some of the details of elements that the agreement contains with a focus to help you understand how you can contribute to attaining the Paris goals, specifically as private sector player, and how can you tackle business opportunities related to it. And if you can go to the next slide, then you can see the market slide that I prepared. The market mechanisms are reinstated as a key instrument in the agreement, although they're called something like cooperative approaches and have other acronyms to them. Two mechanisms seem to be crystallizing out there. One is one that doesn't really have an official name. I called it the Carbon Club. It's basically a framework that would allow and facilitate bilateral or multilateral use of mechanisms such as transporter projects or other activities that can then generate so-called international tradable mitigation outcomes. And they could, for example, be used for Japan to reflect the efforts they have in the Japan crediting mechanism. They could potentially also be used if ever such thing as a credited NAMA would emerge, or they could also emerge simply for accounting reasons if, for example, NDCs are developed by several countries together. And then there's another mechanism, and that has a name. It's called the Sustainable Development Mechanism. It's sort of a reinstatement of a combined CDM and JI mechanism, hopefully without its shortcomings. Some of the perceived shortcomings have already been addressed. For example, there used to be a requirement for permanence in the CDM, and now we have the requirement of long-term abatement. That means that there is actually an open door for forest-related activities. Also, this mechanism is open for the whole world, and it can be additional to it should be additional to NDCs and not additional to any fictive project-by-project baseline. So you see there have been elements of what was the CDM and what is the CDM there. There's also, for example, the existence of a sort of executive board again, and there's provisions for avoiding double counting and so on. So with these two main market mechanisms, that's already a strong signal for those of you that are involved in carbon projects or emission reduction activities in some way. But there's additional points that should be considered. One is the ratcheting up mechanism. Reinhard called it the global stock taking, as it's written in the agreement. That actually allows for a gradual increase in emission, and therefore it could be an opportunity to reduce any sort of oversupply or related issues that came up in the Kyoto Protocol. On RED+, RED+ has received a separate article, Article 5, and payment for environmental services are specifically encouraged. And there's only implicit link to the mechanisms that are mentioned above. For example, there's this goal of long-term abatement, there is the goal of net emission reductions, which again relates to carbon sequestration activities. And there's encouragement of public-private partnerships. Currently on RED+, there's nothing that specifically mentions that these two flexible market mechanisms should apply to it, but there's also nothing that excludes them. And finally, there are some other signals that would be important for the carbon market. Martin already mentioned the commitment that has been done on finance, that is even more upscaled now. And there's also some announcement that have been done in the short term outside of the official negotiations with new facilities that have been put in place. For example, the transformative carbon assets facility with a budget of $250 million, or an N2O reduction initiative by the German government that wants to kind of pilot this new understanding of responsibility, where the Germans want to support N2O abatement until 2020, and afterwards they want to see this sort of N2O avoided by the host countries. Now, this was an overview more for the market players out there, and a note of caution. I don't think there's too many good news for those that own existing CERs, for example, but because there might be issues with the additionality requirement that those existing projects would be additional to those NDCs. That remains to be clarified. It's an open flag. Now, second point, thanks for already advancing the slide, is how can you as a sustainable company take the lead towards low carbon economy that is being asked for in the Paris Agreement? And there's no specific requirement for a private sector company to do this or that under the Paris Agreement. But there are a lot of guidances out there. And one is, there is the commitment to 2 degrees, and there's the goal of 1.5 degrees, and there's a long-term goal for carbon balance. So that allows you to define a sound, long-term science-based emission reduction goal for your company, for example, potentially including an internal price on carbon, which I mentioned because several people were asking about it. Again, there was no carbon price set in the Paris Agreement, but you can set it. Of course, also don't forget the activities you can do if you don't own, if you invest more into other people's projects. Investment decarbonization was talked about a lot in the halls of the Paris Agreement. The second point is, as Reinhard mentioned, there was specific recognition of non-party initiatives. Non-parties are any organizations different to official UNFCCC member countries, so private sectors and others. And there was a lot of talk about reduce at home, finance abroad as a goal to ratcheting up the ambition and getting beyond the NDCs that are out there and to get to the 2-degree goal. So that means all these commitments that some of you have pledged to under the Renewable Energy 100, under the Banking Environment Initiative, under the New York Declaration on Forest have been specifically referred to and are needed to attain this Paris goal. And third point is the Sustainable Development Mechanism actually specifically highlights the goal of CO2 reduction and other sustainability goals. And therefore, some takeaway messages for you as a player could be invest into those projects that might have high amounts of co-benefits. RED Plus is one example. Potentially use insetting. I'll explain what that is all about in a bit. And also focus on different environmental and social issues in a package, for example, by managing water and climate risk jointly. And finally, fill in the voids. There are a lot of things that have not been agreed in Paris. For example, shipping and aviation are not regulated. Hence, there's a lot of room to play for you to demand for carbon neutral services from those shipping and airplane providers. There's of course also the opportunity for you to offset those scope and 3 emissions related to it. They are not in the Paris Agreement currently. And then get involved. The NDC ambition level is variable. Some of them are fairly ambitious, others hopefully don't only hide business as usual in a nice document. So get involved with your governments and the players that are important to define those NDCs. If we move to the next slide, I just want to give you 2 specific opportunities that people have done with us. One is insetting. Insetting basically means that you reduce those emissions that you cannot directly avoid in your own organization because they are in your supply chain by specifically engaging with your supply chain. And there's an example, for example, the Swiss Supermarket Corp. They said, we bring roses in from Kenya and sell them in Switzerland. So let's work with the employees and the farms that grow roses in Kenya, and let's put up solutions such as sustainable, efficient cookstove solutions so that we don't only get carbon neutral roses, but we get a better health for our employees and we get better relationship with our providers in the supply chain. And on the next slide, you can see another example. Renewable energy was probably one of the hugest areas that got a strong signal from Paris. There will be huge opportunity for renewable energy and there will be risk in fossil fuels. For example, you can see that market indexes after the Paris Agreement moved. The MAC Global Solar Energy Index popped up 4.5% the day after Paris. And there were some coal companies in the US that went down share price-wise right after Paris. So on renewable energy, what you can do is if you are not able to install your own solar rooftop, if you're not able to sign up a power purchase agreement by yourself, then there are renewable energy certificates out there that will allow you to support growth in the share of renewable energy in your grid and will allow you to become 100% energy CO2 neutral as required under the RE100. So that's an opportunity for those of you out there that consume a lot of electricity. And with these 2 examples, I'll hand back to Nico. Thank you.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Christian, for your input. Now, I will give floor back to Renat, who will just cherry pick on the vast amount of questions we have received.
Thank you very much, Nico. Thanks to the other speakers. Yeah, indeed, we got a lot of questions, and many of them centered around the future of the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, and I would like to take that one. Of course, the CDM has been a very successful instrument in terms of volume. It has generated thousands of projects, and carbon prices were high for a few years. And as you all know, they collapsed pretty much after it became clear that Kyoto didn't really provide meaningful targets. Now, there is one good news and one bad news for those of you who have CDM projects. The good news is very clearly this: if you read Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, you will find that the text there is surprisingly close to the description of the mechanism there is surprisingly close to what the description of the CDM used to be. So you can even wonder who wrote that. It's really surprising the parallels. So and as we all know, the mechanism itself, the CDM today still exists, so it's still there. So obviously, if and when such a mechanism comes into place, it would probably either take on the same structure, or it would create a very similar one, taking over many elements of the existing structure. So it is highly likely that if and when trading of ITMOs or whatever it's going to be called is possible, CDM will survive. However, there's one big, let's say, bad news here, and it's not really bad news, but it's just a complexity. As we discussed before, in the past there was an Annex 1 and an Annex 2 that was saying who is a developed country and who is a developing country. And for a developing country, it was a no-regret move to give a letter of approval to a CDM project. They had nothing to lose. In the future, under the Paris Agreement, that's different, because every developing country also has a national determined contribution, NDC. This means that it's going to be more complicated to actually generate CRs, because there could be double counting. If you have a project in a country, even if it's a developing country which has a target itself, the question will always be, is that now counting towards the developing country's target or not? And so it's going to be more complicated to generate these units. And if I look at experience we now have in Korea, South Africa, Mexico, everywhere there is an effort ongoing to create a carbon market with an offset component. I can tell you it's taking a while. You have to be patient until these regulations are standing. So long story short, yes, there is going to be something like a CDM. The question is when and how bankable will the whole system be.
Thank you, Renat. Over to Martin.
Okay, I'll take like two questions. There was one question: what does it take to implement the movement from mayors and cities to go into climate action? And this actually has various answers. So certainly, as a city or a mayor, you can learn from your peers, because there's some cities, particularly in the Nordics, that have already shown that they can reduce. You can easily reduce 30, 40, even 50% of your emissions. So you can learn from peers. Then you certainly need also the right national policy signals, so you can implement measures. And finally, as I said, access to finance is key, and particularly one interesting idea is to issue city bonds, and many European and US cities have already shown that this is possible, and certainly other cities that do that will gain access to low-cost finance. Now this brings us to the question, who is investing in these city bonds? And there were many questions from you about what Paris means for investors. And clearly the signal is that you have to reconsider your investment in fossil fuels, because if you take serious the 2-degree or even the aspiration to 1.5-degree target, it means there is no place for fossil fuels somewhere in the future. So any investment in fossil fuels bears a large risk of becoming unvaluable. So there's certainly a carbon bubble issue there potentially. So consider joining the decarbonization coalition that already has $600 billion assets under management that have signed up for this coalition. And then consider investment in green bonds, not just city bonds. You can also consider green bonds from corporates or from governments, from development banks. And then finally, as institutional investors, normally as you're investing in bonds, but also consider investment in infrastructure. And certainly risks are high, but there are now some ways of de-risking investment in infrastructure. There's some bonds, there's some funds out there like the Climate Investor 1 bond or the Global Climate Partnership Fund that contains some de-risking elements that will allow you, even as institutional investors, to go for these investment vehicles and make a contribution to low carbon investment in the next few years.
Christian, are you still with us? The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I had a question came up a lot in the registrations was what's going on with RED Plus and what's going on with finance for RED Plus. And there are some points here. Actually, there is no major new piece of news or decisions on RED Plus, but then again, there are some important ones. One is that, first of all the previous decisions that had been found during the last year and before have been referred to in the agreement, so they're now sort of official and endorsed. The second one is that this important but small wording that says there have to be long-term abatement or emission reductions, but not permanent ones, opens the door a lot to the whole land use sector. And as I said, there is the link, the implicit link to Article 6 and the ITMOs, which RED Plus could potentially use, but again, it hasn't been positively confirmed yet. Also, there have been higher financing pledges, which a lot of them would go into RED Plus. And finally, also the ITMO that I explained could be used for those financing transactions or payment for ecosystem services that are already taking place on a pilot basis, such as with the Germans for ACRE. So there is some sort of recognition of those investments that are being done. Now, I know this doesn't tell you how much a RED Plus carbon credit will be worth. I know that it doesn't give you guarantee that if you start up a RED Plus project now, it will be rewarded in this new scheme, but for now, this is all we got. So I think we are on a good way, but there's still a lot of open flanks to be closed in the next years.
Renat?
Another question that came up a lot was, so after all, what does Paris really mean for industry? What does it really mean for private players? And I think there's three main elements to be mentioned here. First, over the past year, over the coming years, you will see a lot of new domestic policies emerging around the world. In all red-defined countries, you will see new policies. This could include, or decisions, this could include feed-in tariffs for green power. It could include benchmarks for cement industries. It could include subsidy schemes. It could include carbon markets, emission trading, and so on. So this creates price signals. So if you are active with your business in one of these countries, you will see price signals for products and that essentially support low carbon investments. But it's going to be domestic. So that's one. The second element, as we discussed before, Paris does create a playground for multilateral, if not potentially even global, carbon schemes. So you will find emerging, again, price signals for low carbon projects in which you may invest. These are not necessarily global. It could also be regional markets. Already today, for example, we see that the carbon markets of California and Quebec across the border are being linked. And such discussions could happen more often. So that's the second one. The third one, and potentially at some point even most important one, is that Paris creates a lot of momentum. Around Paris, around this political agreement, there have been a big amount of private pledges of companies in many fields, in the consumer goods field, information technology fields, finance industry. And around these pledges, you will find more and more investors actually requiring companies to switch on a low carbon path. So you will find a combination of signals, price signals from governments, and push from investors, which are both based on Paris. And the idea, of course, is that all this will lead to a world where a low carbon path makes economic sense. So that ideally at some point, and I think the chances are pretty high that this is actually going to happen, in many fields, transport, buildings, agriculture, and so on, low carbon strategy is simply more profitable than a high carbon strategy. If that happens, essentially we don't even need Paris and the whole system anymore, because we will solve it by the power of economies. I'm not saying we are there, but the system I was talking about that Paris creates, I believe, is the best option we had for actually getting all hands on deck, public and private, to jointly make it happen.
Thank you, Renat. I'm happy to close this debate at this stage with the closing words. We've heard that the most important is to take action from the variety of actors who have been acknowledged by the COP Forum, including investors, corporate sphere, and also cities, to achieve a future where we can flourish with a low carbon. Now, I would like to thank all of you for your attention. At the same time, I would like to invite you to our upcoming webinar, which is sector specific. We'll concentrate on what's happening in the ICT sector and the trend to move to renewable energy as an alternative source of energy for this specific sector. You can register for 2 dates on our website. If you have further questions, please don't hesitate to get back to us. And yeah, we wish you either good day or good evening. You will receive the follow-up of the webinar in form of a recording. I will also try to answer some of the further questions which has not been answered today. Thank you very much.
And
have a good day. Goodbye.